This is a story of the great family. We have a piece of the desert because so many important things happened in the desert. We needed a small piece of the desert to tell our story. The desert is a wonderful and dangerous place. In the daytime, the desert is very hot, and not much grows in the desert because there is very little water. And at night, the desert can get very cold. And when the wind blows, the sand can sting your skin. So when people go into the desert, they wear many layers of clothes to protect themselves from the sand and the wind. People don't go into the desert unless they have to. After the Great Flood, people moved out to all parts of the world to begin life again. Many people settled along rivers. They settled in small towns and villages, and soon the towns grew to be cities. One of these cities was called Ur, and another one was called Haran. In Ur, the people believed in many gods. And there was a god for the wind, a god for the rain, a god for the trees, a god for the grass, a god for the sky and the stars and the moon. The world was alive with gods. There was one family in Ur that believed that there was a god for everything. And in this family, there was Abram and Sarai. At night, Abram liked to go out into the desert, and he would look up at the stars in the sky and look out at the sand in the desert. And God was close to Abram, and Abram was close to God. And Abram knew what God wanted him to do. God told Abram that he and Sarai will take their family and move to Haran. So they packed up all of their belongings, their animals, and they took with them their family and friends and helpers and all of their things, and they started on their way to Haran. It was a long journey. They traveled along the river, the great Euphrates River, that gave them water to drink and showed them the way. At night, they pitched their tents along the river, and they traveled by day. They traveled with their whole family, old people, children, all the animals, all the helpers. They knew they were getting close when they could see other people leaving the city. They finally reached Haran. And Abram would go out into the desert at night, and God came close to Abram, and Abram was close to God. And God told Abram what God wanted them to do. God wanted Abram and his family to move again. So they took some of their animals and some of their family with them this time, and they headed west into Canaan. This time, there was no river to guide them. They had no water. When they reached a place called Shechem, they climbed the hill and they prayed. They knew that God was with them, and they thanked God for keeping them safe on their journey. And they built an altar there to mark this place where God was with them, and to thank God for keeping them safe. But this was not where God wanted them to stay, so they journeyed on. And when they got outside of Bethel, once again, they gave thanks to God for being with them. God was not just in this place, or this place, or this place, but God was everywhere. And again, they built an altar to thank God for keeping them safe on their journey and for being with them. But this was not where God wanted them to stay, so they moved on. After a time, they reached their destination. And they pitched their tent outside of Hebron beneath the oaks of Mamre. One night, God called Abram out into the desert. God was close to Abram, and Abram was close to God. And Abram knew what God wanted him to do. God told Abram that he and Sarai would become the father and mother of a great nation whose numbers would be greater than the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the desert. When Abram heard this, he laughed because he and Sarai were way too old to have children. But he trusted God. God had told Abram that he should change his name to Abraham and that Sarai should change her name to Sarah. Time passed, and Abraham and Sarah still had no children. One day, three travelers came from the desert, and Abraham went out to greet them and invited them to have to eat with them. And Sarah, being very generous, made three portions of bread, and they ate bread and meat and milk and water. And while they ate, the three travelers told Abraham that he and Sarah would have a child and they would become the mother and father of a great nation. Abraham laughed again. And Sarah, who heard this, who was outside the tent and heard, she laughed too, because they knew they were too old to have children. And the three visitors went on their way. Time passed, and you know what happened? Sarah did have a child. And that child grew to be a fine young man whose name was Isaac. When Abraham and Sarah had Isaac, they named him Isaac because they laughed when he was born. And in their language, Isaac means laughter. Now, when Isaac grew to be a young man, Sarah, who was very old and full of years, died. And Abraham and Isaac buried Sarah in a cave beneath the oaks of Mamre. Abraham was very sad and lonely, but he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he died. He needed to find a wife for his son Isaac. So he sent his most trusted helper back to Haran to find a wife for Isaac because they had family and friends there. And the helper traveled all the way back. When he reached a well just outside the city, he met a young woman there named Rebecca. Rebecca was very kind and generous. She helped him get water for himself and his animals, and she invited him to have dinner with her family. And while they ate, the helper told Rebecca and her family all about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and all about the great family. And Rebecca knew she wanted to be part of this family. So she set out on her own journey because she was as brave as she was kind. And when she came close, Isaac went out to greet her. After a time, Rebecca and Isaac were married. And Abraham, who was very old and so full of years, died. And Isaac and Rebekah buried Abraham next to Sarah beneath the oaks of Mamre. Isaac and Rebekah, over time, had children. And their children grew, and they had children. And their children grew, and they had children. And this went on and on for generations and generations. And then your grandparents were born. And they grew up, and they had children. And their children grew, and they had children. And then you were born. And you became a part of the great family whose numbers are greater than the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the desert. Now I wonder what is your favorite part of this story? I wonder what's the most important part? I wonder if there is a part of this story that we can take out and still tell our story. I wonder where you see yourself in this story. Where are you in the great family?